The harsh red sun was setting over the wastelands of Aeon 4, casting long shadows across the jagged plains. Dry winds stirred the dusty remnants of ancient stones and carried faint whispers from a past that only the stars themselves remembered. Amid the desolation, a lone figure struggled, half crawling and half dragging herself across the cracked earth. She was injured, visibly limping, her gait hindered by a deep wound across her left side. Small spurts of green blood stained the ground behind her, but she pressed on, her singular goal to survive until dawn, or until someone, came to end her misery. Her name was Virith, a member of the Xylith, a reclusive alien race known for their resilience and sharp intellect. They were an advanced, proud people who rarely ventured beyond their own territories. But the war had reached every corner of the galaxy, pulling her into a conflict she'd spent her life trying to avoid. And now, she was stranded, alone and injured, her comm device shattered beyond repair and her navigation systems offline. For the first time, Virith felt a chilling realization. She might not make it back home. Every breath sent a spike of pain through her body, but she continued forward. She remembered the ambush that had left her here, how her small reconnaissance vessel had been ripped from the sky by a surprise attack. The initial explosion had sent her hurtling into the desolate wasteland below, her survival more a stroke of luck than any skill on her part. A flicker of movement caught her attention. Instinctively, she pressed herself against the dry ground, her pale eyes scanning the horizon. Her vision blurred momentarily from the pain, but she blinked rapidly, her senses returning to focus. It was a human? No, that didn't seem right. No human would be out here, not in the middle of enemy territory. But there it was, moving with an oddly deliberate pace, as though searching for something. Virith's mind raced. Humans, as she knew, were unpredictable creatures, as quick to offer aid as they were to deliver destruction. She had read reports about them, had even encountered a few in brief missions. The stories were filled with contradictions. Some spoke of their kindness, their fierce loyalty, while others recounted their ruthlessness in combat. What would this one do if he found her? A part of her wanted to hide, to disappear into the sands, but another part of her, driven by the primal need for survival, clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, this human would show mercy. She remained still, barely breathing, watching the figure approach. The human stopped not far from her, his eyes scanning the ground carefully. He appeared disheveled, dirt smeared across his face and clothes, but there was a strange air of purpose in his movements, as though he had been searching for her specifically. As he drew closer, Virith could make out more details. He wore a simple uniform, tattered at the edges, with patches that suggested he was from an old military division, possibly a scout left behind after a failed mission. She wondered if he, too, had found himself stranded on this god-forsaken planet. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the world around them faded into silence. She braced herself for what would come next, a shot, a blow, an accusation. But instead, the human spoke, his voice low and calm. "You're hurt," he said simply. She blinked, taken aback by the statement. Of all the things she had expected, concern was the last. She managed a small nod, wincing as the movement reopened the wound on her side. The human knelt down, his hand instinctively reaching toward his pack. She watched him warily, every muscle in her body tensed. He seemed to notice her hesitation and raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Easy. I'm just getting my medkit," he said, his voice soft, as though speaking to a wounded animal. Her mind screamed at her to flee, to stay alert. She didn't know this human, didn't know what his true intentions were. But her body betrayed her. She was too weak, her energy sapped from the endless hours of crawling through the wasteland. So, she remained still, her gaze never leaving him as he produced a small, worn medkit. He opened it carefully, his hands moving with a surprising gentleness. She watched, curious despite herself, as he extracted a vial of antiseptic and a roll of gauze. She flinched as he approached, but he only paused, giving her a questioning look. "Will you let me help you?" he asked, his voice steady. Viratha's gaze flickered, searching for any trace of deception. She could see exhaustion in his eyes, lines that suggested he had been out here for days, maybe weeks. Whatever he had been through, it had taken its toll on him. Yet here he was, offering assistance to an alien he had no reason to trust. Finally, with a reluctant nod, she allowed him to come closer. The antiseptic stung, and she hissed, her claws digging into the dirt. He worked quickly, his movements efficient but careful, as though he had done this countless times before. As he wrapped the gauze around her wound, Virath felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion. Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The human paused, his gaze meeting hers once more. For a moment, he seemed to consider the question, as though weighing his answer. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe because you needed help. Out here it's lonely." His voice trailed off, and she saw a flicker of something unspoken in his eyes, a hint of pain that went beyond the surface. She said nothing, her mind racing to comprehend his response. The Xyolith had always prided themselves on self-reliance, on the belief that one's survival was a testament to their strength. This human's words, his actions, were alien to her in every sense of the word. He finished bandaging her wound and sat back, his shoulders slumping as though the effort had drained him. Virath studied him carefully, noting the thinness of his frame, the hollowness in his cheeks. It seemed that he, too, was running on the last reserves of his strength. "Do you have a name?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. He looked at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Ethan," he replied. "Ethan Collins, former scout for the Galactic Alliance." "Virath," she replied, the name sounding foreign even to her own ears. She hadn't introduced herself in a long time, not since leaving her homeworld. Ethan nodded, a faint hint of recognition in his gaze. "Xyolith, right? I've heard of your people. Guess I never thought I'd actually meet one." Virath nodded, still uncertain what to make of him. Humans, after all, were known for their unpredictability. Yet Ethan's presence here, his willingness to help her, defied everything she thought she knew. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sounds of something distant, perhaps the remnants of battle or the approach of a storm. She looked toward the horizon, a sense of dread creeping into her bones. "We should move," she said finally, her voice stronger now. Ethan seemed to understand, without asking questions. He rose, extending a hand toward her. She hesitated for a moment before accepting it, allowing him to help her to her feet. And together, they began to walk across the wastelands, two unlikely allies bound by a shared determination to survive. Ethan's breathing was ragged as they climbed over the uneven, rocky terrain. The sky above Aeon 4 had shifted to a bruised purple, the two small moons casting ghostly shadows across the wasteland. Virath walked beside him, her gait steadier now, but still carrying a slight limp, her green blood occasionally staining the dust beneath her. Neither spoke for a long time, each step an effort as they conserved their energy. Ethan could feel the silence growing heavy, but he sensed that Virath wasn't one for idle conversation. Still, her expression held a curiosity, as if she were studying him as much as he was her. They crested a ridge and looked out over the sprawling ruins of what might have once been a city. The remnants of towers jutted from the ground like broken teeth, and shattered walls bore marks of weapons long since disintegrated. Ethan felt an odd mix of sorrow and wonder as he took in the sight. "How did you end up here?" Virath finally broke the silence, her tone neutral, but edged with curiosity. Ethan took a deep breath, the acrid air stinging his lungs. "Shot down during a recon mission. My ship didn't exactly glide down as smoothly as yours did." He gave a dry chuckle, though the humor quickly faded. "The rest of my crew, they didn't make it." Virath gave a small nod. She seemed to understand without prying, the way soldiers sometimes did, acknowledging loss without letting it define the moment. Instead, She gestured toward a half-collapsed structure nearby. "There," she said, her voice low. "We can shelter until the sun rises." They made their way into the shadowed remnants of the structure, each step echoing softly. The air inside was cooler, the thick stone walls sheltering them from the dry wind outside. Ethan dropped his pack with a sigh of relief and slumped against a wall, watching as Virith inspected their surroundings. In the dim light, Ethan could see her face more clearly. Her features were sharp and angular, alien yet oddly familiar, like the blurred memory of someone he once knew. He found himself wondering how many battles she had fought, what she'd left behind. "What about you?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "Why were you out here?" Virith hesitated, her gaze shifting to the broken walls around them as if she could see beyond them, into the stars. "I'm not a soldier." "Not really. I was a scout, sent to gather intel on this system. But plans rarely go as expected." She gave a soft, almost bitter laugh. "Turns out the enemy had a few scouts of their own." Ethan nodded. "Surprise ambushes. They've been using those a lot lately. We've lost countless teams that way." Virith's gaze turned hard, a flicker of anger flashing in her eyes. "They're a plague across the galaxy, always expanding, always devouring. My people kept to ourselves, avoided conflict, but," her voice trailed off, the bitterness unmistakable. Ethan knew that tone well. He'd heard it in his own voice, in the voices of friends who had fallen in battles far from home. War had a way of drawing even the unwilling into its orbit, transforming bystanders into soldiers. A silence settled between them again, though it felt less tense this time. Outside, the wind howled, and the faint sounds of distant creatures echoed through the ruins. Ethan leaned his head back against the cold stone, his eyes drifting shut. A faint rustle startled him awake. Virith had moved closer, her gaze fixed on a small device she held in her hand, the faint glow illuminating her face. It looked like a communicator, but from the way she handled it, he guessed it was broken. "Trying to get a signal?" he asked quietly. She nodded, her fingers moving deftly over the device's surface. "The chances are slim," but her voice trailed off, and she glanced at him, an unspoken question lingering in her gaze. "Guess it's worth a shot," he replied. "Can I take a look?" She hesitated, then handed him the device. It was more advanced than anything he'd worked with, but he recognized enough of the components to get a rough idea of how it functioned. He pulled a small toolkit from his pack and began carefully prying the cover open. Virith watched in silence as he worked, her gaze intense. After a few minutes, he managed to reroute a damaged circuit, though it would be a temporary fix at best. "Try it now," he said, handing it back to her. Virith activated the device, her face hopeful. The faintest flicker of a signal appeared on the display before disappearing into static. She sighed, her expression tightening with frustration, but gave him a nod of gratitude. "It's more than it was before," she admitted. Ethan gave a shrug. "Just a patch job, but it might buy us enough time to get an actual signal." Virith studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You're different from the others I've encountered." "Most humans are," he replied with a smirk. "You get a lot of us out here, and each one's a new flavor of unpredictable." She raised an eyebrow, the gesture surprisingly familiar, even with her alien features. "It's a wonder your species has survived this long." "Same goes for yours," he shot back, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. The brief flash of humor faded as his mind turned back to the reality of their situation. "If that device can't send out a distress call, then we're stuck here for good." The truth of his words settled between them like a weight. They were alone on a hostile planet, two survivors from opposite sides, clinging to the faintest hope of rescue. Virith's gaze hardened, and she looked out at the darkening horizon, as if contemplating the vast distance between herself and her people. "It's not over yet," she said, a spark of determination flaring in her eyes. For the first time, he felt a strange sense of kinship with her, an understanding that went beyond words. Here they were, two lost souls fighting against the odds, bound not by loyalty or duty, but by the simple will to survive. The night crept on. The silence, broken only by the distant sounds of the alien creatures stirring outside the ruins. Morning arrived with an eerie stillness, the twin suns casting sharp shadows across the wasteland. Virith rose first, wincing as she checked her wound. Ethan sat up, watching her quietly as she wrapped her side with makeshift bandages. Outside, the ruins glinted in the pale sunlight, stretching out like a graveyard of an ancient civilization. "We need supplies," she said, breaking the silence. "And water. I saw something resembling a riverbed when I was approaching the ruins yesterday." Ethan nodded, slinging his pack over his shoulder. "Let's hope it hasn't dried out entirely." They set out, moving cautiously through the ruins, senses attuned to every sound. Ethan could feel the oppressive heat building, and the cracked earth beneath their feet radiated warmth as the suns climbed higher. Virith took the lead, her alien grace evident in her movements. Though injured, she navigated the landscape with a precision he couldn't help but admire. Ahead, a twisted piece of metal jutted from the ground, glinting dully in the sunlight. Ethan stopped, narrowing his eyes. "Is that?" Virith examined it, her eyes narrowing. "A drone fragment. Recon model Xylith make. It was shot down recently." Ethan crouched, running his fingers along the scorched edge. "They're looking for something or someone?" He glanced at her. "Could be a search party. Or a hunting party," Virith replied, her expression darkening. "Not everyone sent out here is friendly. There are factions that don't abide by the treaties, even among our own." Ethan looked back toward the ruins, then at her. "If they're tracking us, they're close. We need to move faster." They quickened their pace, heading toward the remnants of a dry riverbed winding through the valley below. Rocks jutted from the cracked ground, some worn smooth by what must have once been a powerful current. A few shallow pools of water clung to the shadows, remnants of a time when the planet's climate hadn't been quite so harsh. Ethan knelt by one of the pools, checking the water with a portable tester from his pack. The screen flickered, then displayed a safe reading. "Drinkable," he said, handing her a container. She took it, her expression unreadable, and drank carefully, conserving every drop. A distant hum interrupted their quiet. Virith's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. Ethan heard it too, a sound he knew well. Hovercraft engines. "Hide!" she hissed, grabbing his arm and pulling him into the shadow of a nearby rock formation. They crouched low, backs pressed against the stone. As the hum grew louder, Ethan could feel the vibrations in the ground, growing stronger by the second. Two hovercrafts appeared, their sleek forms gliding above the ground, trailing dust in their wake. Each was emblazoned with an unfamiliar symbol, sharp and aggressive, nothing like the Xylith markings Virith wore. He watched as they slowed near the drone fragment, circling like predators, scenting fresh blood. "Scavengers," Virith muttered, barely audible. "They're likely outlaws. They take down stranded ships and pick them clean." Ethan clenched his jaw. He'd encountered scavengers before, mercenaries without allegiance, loyal only to the highest bidder. Their operations were brutal, their tactics ruthless. If they found them, mercy wouldn't be an option. The hovercraft stopped, and a figure climbed out, dressed in patchwork armor that looked cobbled together from various military factions. He scanned the area, holding a device that blinked with a soft red light, tracking their energy signatures or some trace of movement. Virith's hand went to her side, pulling a slender blade from a hidden sheath. Her face was set, her expression cold and calculating. Ethan reached for his own weapon, a small pistol, its energy cell nearly depleted. They shared a brief glance, a silent understanding passing between them. The scavenger moved closer, his device beeping more rapidly as he approached their hiding place. His eyes were sharp, glinting with a cruel anticipation. Ethan tensed, preparing to strike, when Virith moved faster than he expected. She leapt from their hiding spot, her blade flashing in the morning light. The scavenger barely had time to react before she struck, her movements swift and precise. His weapon fell to the ground as he staggered, clutching his side. Ethan followed, taking down the second scavenger with a quick shot before he could draw his weapon. The hovercraft engines whined, sensing the sudden chaos, and the remaining scavenger retreated, calling out in a language Ethan didn't understand. "They'll be back," Virith said, her voice steady as she retrieved her blade. "With more of them?" Ethan nodded grimly. "Then we need to leave now." They ran, pushing their bodies to the limit as they weaved through the rocky landscape. Behind them, the hum of the hovercraft engines faded, but neither slowed, knowing the reprieve would be short-lived. They moved through the rough terrain in silence, their pace relentless. Every now and then, Virith's gaze darted back, scanning for the faintest hint of pursuit. Ethan noticed her favoring her injured side, the strain in her movements unmistakable. He didn't mention it. They both knew slowing down wasn't an option. The sky was clouded now, casting a dim light over the landscape. Ahead, a narrow canyon cut through the rocky wasteland, its walls sheer and jagged. It would be easier to defend if the scavengers caught up, but it was a double-edged sword, no escape if they were cornered. As they reached the canyon entrance, Virith stopped, her gaze sharpening. She knelt, examining the ground, where faint footprints led deeper into the narrow pass. "Someone else has been here recently," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan frowned, studying the footprints. They were humanoid, small, and left uneven marks, as if whoever made them was unsteady. He pointed to a faint smear of dark fluid near one print. "Blood. They're injured." Virith's face hardened. "Whoever they are, they may have allies ahead. We can't afford another ambush." But curiosity won out over caution. They moved quietly along the trail, shadows stretching over them as they descended deeper into the canyon. The footprints led them around a bend where a small, makeshift camp lay half-hidden among the rocks. A figure sat slumped against the canyon wall, breathing shallowly. It was a young woman, human, her uniform tattered, marked with the insignia of a civilian research team. Her face was pale, her hands covered in dust and dried blood. She looked up as they approached, her eyes widening. "Your alliance," she croaked, her gaze lingering on Ethan's uniform. Ethan knelt, taking in her injuries. A gash ran along her thigh, poorly bandaged, and her left arm hung at an awkward angle. She looked like she'd been out here for days. "Former alliance," he said. "We're just passing through." The woman coughed, grimacing as she tried to shift. "My team, we were studying the ruins. Scavengers hit us 2 nights ago. I lost them." Virith's gaze sharpened. "Did they find anything valuable?" The woman blinked, confused, her gaze moving to Virith's alien features. "A relic, ancient tech buried in the ruins. But it's dangerous. There's a reason this place was abandoned. The scavengers, they don't understand." Ethan and Virith exchanged a glance. Scavengers wouldn't care if the relic posed a threat, only that it could be sold to the highest bidder. And if it was powerful enough, it could bring more danger to an already fragile piece. "Where is it?" Ethan asked. The woman's face twisted with fear. "Deeper in the ruins, a hidden chamber. They'll kill anyone who tries to take it from them. Please, don't go after it. It's a death sentence." Virith's gaze remained cool, calculating. If they're here for weapon, they won't stop until they have it. Leaving it with them is a bigger risk than taking it back. The woman's hand gripped his arm, her fingers trembling. "Promise me you'll destroy it. Don't let them have it." Ethan glanced at Virith, who gave a slight nod. "We'll make sure they don't." The woman's hand fell away as exhaustion overtook her. She slumped back against the canyon wall, her breathing shallow. Ethan carefully rewrapped her injuries, using a small ration of water to clean the wound. She barely moved, eyes slipping shut. "We can't leave her here," Ethan said, glancing at Virith. "We also can't stay," Virith replied, her tone unwavering. "There's a small chance her signal will reach a rescue ship once we're gone. But we need to keep moving. Ethan hated the practicality of it, but she was right. They left a small energy beacon beside her, its blue light flickering as it activated, broadcasting a distress signal. Then, with one last glance, they slipped back into the shadows of the canyon, moving faster now. The canyon led to a series of caves, their interiors dimly lit by cracks in the stone above. A dull sound echoed through the narrow passage, the hum of machinery. Virith motioned for silence, her gaze alert as they edged closer. In a cavern ahead, several scavengers gathered around a crude setup of equipment, their eyes fixed on a pedestal in the center of the room. A metallic device sat on the pedestal, its surface covered in shifting symbols that seemed to move in response to their voices. The air felt charged, humming with a strange energy that made Ethan's skin prickle. "It's a containment unit," Virith whispered, eyes narrowing as she studied the device. "Ancient Xylith tech, designed to house something volatile. Something lethal." The scavenger leader, a burly figure with a scar running down his cheek, stepped closer to the device, speaking in low tones to his crew. Ethan could catch only fragments of the conversation, mentions of power, of weaponized potential. Virith clenched her fists. "They don't know what they're handling. If they activated..." Ethan nodded. "We take them out, disable the device, and leave this place in one piece." The plan was simple, but the odds were anything but. The scavengers outnumbered them 3-1, armed and ready. But Virith moved first, her blade flashing as she took down the nearest guard in silence. Ethan followed, drawing his pistol and firing a quick shot at the next. The scavengers scattered, shouting as they scrambled for cover. The leader barked an order, drawing his weapon. He aimed at Virith, firing a shot that grazed her arm. She flinched, but didn't slow, charging forward and slashing through his defenses. Ethan held his ground, keeping the others at bay with precise shots. In the chaos, one scavenger grabbed the containment unit, his fingers brushing its surface. Instantly, the device pulsed, symbols flaring with a fierce light that cast an eerie glow over the cavern. A low rumble filled the room, and the air grew thick, heavy with a power neither Ethan nor Virith understood. "Put it down," Virith shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. The scavenger hesitated, eyes wide with greed and fear. But he didn't listen. He gripped the device tighter, as if it would obey him. In a flash of blue light, the device activated fully, emitting a shockwave that sent everyone sprawling. Ethan scrambled to his feet, disoriented, his head pounding. The containment unit hovered above the pedestal now, its energy swirling, releasing waves of force that cracked the walls around them. "We have to shut it down," Virith shouted over the deafening hum. Ethan nodded, rushing forward with Virith at his side. They fought their way through the chaos, dodging stray shots as the remaining scavengers tried desperately to control the device. Virith reached the pedestal, her fingers moving deftly over the device's controls. Symbols blinked out, and the energy pulse weakened, but it was still dangerously unstable. Ethan covered her, keeping the scavengers at bay as she worked. Finally, with one last touch, the device powered down, its hum fading into silence. Virith stepped back, breathing hard, her eyes fixed on the now dormant unit. The remaining scavengers fled, their morale broken, leaving the device behind. Ethan and Virith exchanged a glance, the relief shared in silence. But both knew the artifact was still dangerous, and leaving it intact was not an option. Virith's gaze turned cold as she produced an energy charge from her belt, setting it carefully against the containment unit. Ethan followed her lead, placing his own charge on the pedestal. As they retreated, a low rumble shook the cavern, dust falling from the ceiling. Moments later, the charges detonated, the blast echoing through the canyon, collapsing the entrance and burying the relic beneath tons of stone. When the dust settled, they stood at the edge of the ruins, watching as the last remnants of the ancient weapon were swallowed by silence. They moved swiftly from the canyon, each step on high alert. The blast had surely drawn attention, And even if the scavengers scattered, others would come looking. Viratha's wound bled through the fresh bandage, but she gave no sign of slowing. They found cover among a cluster of rocks, where Ethan quickly rechecked their supplies. Their water was low, and they had only a few emergency rations left. With a grim look, he handed Virath a small portion, watching her chew in silence. "We need to find a way off this rock," he said, scanning the horizon. She nodded. "If my people picked up the distress signal we left with the researcher, there's a slim chance they'll investigate. But it's no guarantee." A faint hum drifted on the wind, and they froze, exchanging a quick look. The sound grew louder, unmistakably the engine of a small craft. They ducked lower as a scout ship appeared over the ridge, hovering in the air before settling down near the canyon entrance. A squad of 4 emerged, heavily armored and carrying high-powered scanners. Alliance insignia gleamed on their shoulders. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Alliance. Not scavengers this time. Could be a rescue. Virath didn't relax. Or they're here to claim what the scavengers missed. Alliance takes just as much as it gives. We're not safe yet. The soldiers began sweeping the area, their scanners lighting up as they took readings from the canyon. Ethan's fingers twitched toward his pistol, but Virath put a hand on his arm. "Let me try something," she whispered, slipping away before he could protest. She moved like a shadow, positioning herself behind a nearby ridge. From his vantage point, Ethan saw her raise her communicator, tuning it to a faint frequency. It let out a static pulse, faint but unmistakable, designed to sound like a distress beacon. The soldiers froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. They approached Viratha's position cautiously, and she stayed hidden until they were close. Then she stepped out, hands raised, her stance calculated and neutral. "Identify yourself," the lead soldier barked, weapon trained on her. "I am Virath of the Xylith," she said, her voice calm but with authority. "My vessel was downed, and I've been stranded here with an Alliance officer." She nodded subtly toward Ethan's hiding place. The soldier's weapon lowered slightly, though his gaze was wary. "Your Alliance?" Ethan stepped into view, keeping his hands visible. "Former Alliance. Recon Scout. My team was lost in the crash. She saved my life, and we've been on the run from scavengers since." The lead soldier sized them up, his gaze shifting between them and the smoke rising from the canyon. "Those scavengers, did they have a containment device?" he asked sharply. "There's been interest from several factions in a relic here, something capable of devastating energy surges." "We destroyed it," Virath replied, her tone unyielding. It was too dangerous to leave intact. The soldier's jaw tightened. He looked back at the smoke, a hint of frustration flashing in his eyes. But he nodded, accepting it with a reluctant grimace. "You made the right call. Do you have a way off-world?" Ethan asked, eyes steady. "We've been out here for days." The soldier nodded, signaling to his squad. "We'll take you to the extraction point. You'll be transported to the nearest Alliance base for debriefing." "Both of you?" Ethan exchanged a glance with Virath. This debriefing could mean anything, from routine questioning to extended detainment, especially with Viratha's status as a Xylith scout. But the soldiers didn't wait for a reply, already moving toward the ship. They boarded in silence, settling into cramped seats as the craft lifted off. Ethan noticed Viratha's tense posture, her gaze unwavering as she stared straight ahead. The hum of the engines filled the air, a familiar sound, but somehow heavier now, laden with all they'd left behind on that planet. As the craft ascended, a soldier beside them monitored a data terminal, sending coordinates to the Alliance base. Ethan caught a quick glimpse of the location, a remote outpost orbiting a neutral planet. Virath noticed it too, her expression carefully neutral, but he saw the flicker of understanding in her eyes. "Alliance has been tightening their control across these sectors," she murmured quietly, only loud enough for Ethan to hear. "Every relic, every unclaimed technology, they take it all. The galaxy is turning into their scavenging ground." Ethan's jaw clenched. He'd seen it himself over the years, how the Alliance justified each claim as a step toward peace, stability, control. But it wasn't peace they were leaving behind on Aeon 4. It was a ruin they were looting. The craft touched down at the outpost, the soldiers escorting them off with brisk efficiency. Inside the base, rows of sterile, featureless halls greeted them, the walls echoing with the quiet hum of machinery. Ethan and Virith were led to a stark room, bare except for 2 chairs and a low table. A stern officer entered, datapad in hand, his gaze sharp as he took in their battered appearance. "Report," he said, his voice clipped. Ethan took the lead. "Our vessels were downed in the wasteland near the ruins. We survived by staying out of scavenger reach. They were in pursuit of a containment unit, something that could release dangerous energy pulses." The officer's eyes narrowed. "The containment unit. Where is it?" "Destroyed," Virith replied calmly. "The device was unstable beyond control. Leaving it intact would have endangered the sector." The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. "Do you have any proof of this?" Virith's gaze was steady. "I would have brought you proof if there was anything left to bring. But we weren't going to die over a relic your teams could barely contain." The officer studied her, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he exhaled and tapped something on his datapad. "Both of you will be debriefed separately. Your actions will be assessed. And if the report checks out, you'll be processed for release." Ethan glanced at Virith, feeling the weight of the unspoken threat. They'd saved the sector from a potentially catastrophic weapon, but they were at the mercy of an authority that viewed them as assets, not people. Virith met his gaze, her eyes unreadable. "We survived the desert," she murmured. "This won't be any worse." They were escorted out of the room, separated as they went down opposite halls, and as Ethan moved further into the maze of the Alliance base, he couldn't shake the sense that their real fight for freedom had only just begun. Ethan sat alone in a stark, featureless room, his wrists strapped to the table before him. The hum of the overhead lights buzzed softly, the silence stretching longer with each passing minute. He knew how these things went: make him wait, get him anxious, wear him down. He'd been on the other side of this setup countless times, watching suspects sweat under the white light. But today, he felt none of the usual anticipation, only a cold, simmering resolve. After what felt like hours, the door finally slid open, and a tall officer with graying hair and a well-worn uniform entered, taking the seat across from him. The officer held a datapad, scrolling through it as though Ethan were just another line in a list. "You're Ethan Collins, former recon scout for the Galactic Alliance," he began without looking up. "Discharged, currently unaffiliated, yet still operating in active sectors." "That's right," Ethan replied, his tone steady. He knew better than to give anything away. The officer looked up, his gaze piercing. "And yet, here you are, found with a Xylith scout, tampering with a containment device that the Alliance had marked as high-priority tech." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "That device was a threat. If you'd been there, you'd have seen it yourself. It could have wiped out half the sector if it fell into the wrong hands." The officer raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Convenient that there's no trace of it left. Convenient that it's only your word against the logs." Ethan's gaze didn't falter. "Logs don't cover the reality out there. You know it as well as I do." The officer leaned forward, his voice low. "We're not interested in your opinions, Collins. What I want to know is what the Xylith scout told you about the containment device, and why the two of you were so eager to destroy it instead of secure it." Ethan met the officer's stare with quiet defiance. "We did what was necessary to keep the sector safe. If that doesn't line up with Alliance protocol, then maybe you need to take a look at why we're out there in the first place." The officer's mouth tightened, and he tapped something on his datapad. "You'll be held here until we complete our investigation. But I suggest you think carefully about how much loyalty you feel toward this scout. You may be more valuable to us if you're willing to talk." With that, he left, and the silence pressed in again, heavy and stifling. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. If he knew Virith, she'd be facing the same pressure if not worse. And he had no idea how much time they had left to get out. Later, under the cover of dimming lights that signaled the base's quiet hours, a soft knock interrupted his thoughts. The door slid open, and a figure stepped in. It was a young technician, someone he didn't recognize. She carried a maintenance tablet, looking down at it as though performing routine checks. But when she looked up, her eyes held a spark of determination. "You don't know me," she whispered quickly, glancing over her shoulder, "but I know you. And I know what you did down there." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Who are you?" "Someone who's tired of watching the Alliance claim everything for itself," she replied. She pressed a slim metal card into his hand. "This will get you into the East Wing, where they're holding your Xylith friend. You've got about 10 minutes before the next shift change. After that, you're on your own." Before he could ask anything more, she was gone, leaving only the metal card in his hand. Ethan stood, his mind racing, and took a breath. There was no time to question motives now. He slipped the card into the door's control panel, feeling a flicker of relief as it unlocked with a soft beep. Moving quickly but carefully, he followed the directions she'd given him, slipping past the silent halls of the base. Every step felt like a heartbeat pounding in his chest, each turn bringing him closer to Viritha's holding cell. When he reached it, he saw 2 guards stationed outside, both looking bored, their stances relaxed. Ethan waited until one turned away, then sprang forward, bringing down the guard closest to him with a precise hit. The other reached for his weapon, but Ethan was faster, knocking him out cold before he could even call for help. He entered the cell, finding Virith standing near the back wall, her eyes fierce even in the dim light. "Not the escape I imagined," she said, a hint of a smirk in her voice. "Guess I'm better with on-the-fly plans," he replied, grinning. "Let's go." They moved quickly, retracing his steps through the base, keeping to the shadows. Alarms hadn't sounded yet, and he hoped they'd reach an escape pod or cargo shuttle before anyone noticed. But as they approached the docking bay, a loud klaxon pierced the air. "Looks like our luck's run out," Virith muttered, eyes narrowing. "Then let's make it count," he replied. They sprinted toward a docked shuttle, guards flooding into the bay. Ethan fired a few shots, covering Virith as she dashed to the shuttle's controls. She tapped in commands, and the engines hummed to life. The guards aimed, shouting orders. But before they could fire, the shuttle lurched forward, taking off with a burst of speed. Once they were clear of the docking bay, Virith activated the shuttle's thrusters, propelling them into open space. Ethan breathed a sigh of relief, sinking into his seat. But Viritha's face was set, her gaze fixed on the stars ahead. "Where to now?" he asked, glancing over at her. "We're not safe," she replied. "The Alliance will track this vessel. But I know of a place, a remote station hidden. My people keep it off the maps." Ethan nodded, understanding. They were both running now, caught between 2 forces that saw them as assets, as expendable. But together, perhaps they could carve out something more than survival. They flew in silence, the stars streaking by, the weight of everything they'd left behind settling over them. But despite the uncertain future, Ethan felt a strange, tentative hope. In the vast emptiness of space, they weren't alone.